Chapter 12 involves public order crimes, or crimes against the public. They include offenses that affect the quality of life, or vice crimes. Some examples are things like disturbing the peace, which we won't really talk about here. What we're going to talk about mostly are the vice crimes, drug offenses, prostitution, certain sex offenses. And they're also known as victimless crimes, where there's no actual person who is harmed. And I want to start with where these vice crimes originated from. These crimes basically offend the sensibilities or morals. Since the first European settlements in North America in the early 17th century, governments in America have tried to regulate morality. The early colonists equated sin with crime, such offenses as showing lack of reverence towards God or holding beliefs that conflicts with church doctrine or engaging in adultery. These were considered criminal acts and dealt with by sometimes severe punishments. Actions and behavior that do not conform to accepted standards of what is considered right or wrong are called public order crimes. Social standards or morals can change through time, triggering changes in criminal law. The colonies had blue laws, so-called, because they were printed on blue paper, and banning certain activities, such as work on Sundays. Blue laws in Europe even forced what people could eat and wear on Sundays according to their social status. Moral offenses decreased over time as the public accepted that certain forms of social deviation, though still perhaps offensive to most, should not be considered a crime. Types of modern-day moral offenses include the sale of obscene materials, certain kinds of sexual activity, drug and alcohol abuse, gambling. Offenses often involve behavior between two consenting adults with no immediate victims to bring charges. This is why moral offenses are sometimes referred to as victimless crimes. The activity commonly involves one person providing goods, such as drugs, or services, gambling or prostitution, to another, with no one to file a criminal complaint claiming injury. These are crimes simply because they were outlawed. Therefore, the criminal justice system must rely on crimes simply because they were outlawed. Therefore, relying on informants and undercover agents and surveillance equipment to detect or investigate these kinds of crimes. Critics of moral offenses claim they should not be considered crimes, but rather discouraged through better parenting and the community in other ways. Critics further claim making these activities crimes creates a black market that can lead to other more serious crimes, including violence. Others, however, contend that society as a whole is a victim and that deviant behaviors, as well as the friends and family of those involved in the criminal activity. For example, drug use can lead to property crime by a person trying to pay for an expensive as well destructive habit. Prostitution can cause the spread of disease and put the prostitutes in potentially violent situations. If moral offenses were allowed to occur in a community legally, then more serious criminal activity would likely follow. These are according to those who consider moral offenses a crime. These offenses should remain an illegal criminal activity, which in turn will protect the moral fiber of communities. We discussed moral crusaders and moral crusades earlier in the semester. I think it was week 1 or week 2. A moral entrepreneur is an individual, group, or formal organization that seeks to influence a group to adopt or maintain a norm. Moral entrepreneurs are those who take the lead in labeling a particular behavior and spreading a popularized and using popularization of this label throughout society. This can include attributing negative labels to behavior as well as the removal of negative behaviors or labels. Positively labeling or removing positive labels. They do both. They act in both ways. The moral entrepreneur may press for the creation or enforcement of a norm for any number of reasons, or selfish reasons, altruistic reasons. Such individuals or groups also hold the power to generate moral panic. Similarly, multiple moral entrepreneurs may have conflicting goals and work to counteract each other. Some examples of moral entrepreneurs are MAD, Mothers Against Drunk Driving, the anti-tobacco lobby, the gun control lobby, anti-pornography groups, LGBT social movements, and the pro-life and the pro-choice movements. That's an example of two moral entrepreneurs working against each other on a single issue. The term moral entrepreneur was coined by sociologist Howard S. Beckert. In his view, moral entrepreneurs are rule creators. The rule creators generally express the conviction that some kind of threatening social evil exists that must be combated. They can be seen as moral crusaders who are concerned chiefly with the successful persuasion of others, but are not concerned with the means by which this persuasion is achieved. Successful moral crusades are generally dominated by those in the upper social strata of society. They often include religious groups, lawmaking bodies, stakeholders in a given field. There is a political competition in which these moral crusaders originate. Their crusades aimed at generating reform based on what they think is moral, therefore defining deviance. Moral crusaders must have power, public support, generate public awareness of the issue, and be able to propose a clear and acceptable solution to the problem. After a time, crusaders become dependent upon experts and professionals who serve a legitimized a moral creed on technical and scientific grounds. So, moral entrepreneurs may be acting in a way that is more beneficial to them than society, and they have the power to do that and convince our lawmakers to pass laws or to keep laws. Legalization of marijuana is another one. That might be the one that we talked about at the beginning of the semester. But that's the reason why we have moral types of crimes. So let's dive into some of these. We're going to switch into sex-related offenses. Now, certainly, there are sex-related offenses where there's a victim, rape. We talked about it under violent crimes. In this chapter, we're going to discuss two areas of deviant sex practices. And we're also going to talk about drugs later on in this chapter. The book starts summarizing 3 high-profile cases involving the abduction of women and children who are held captive and raped and beaten repeatedly. In each instance, the captor was caught and now serving life sentences. But sadly, these cases are not rare. And obviously, these cases involve an actual victim, J.C. Lee Dugard. She was kidnapped at 11 years old, held captive for 18 years, raped, beaten. She ended up having children from her captor. Elizabeth Smart was kidnapped from her home and held for 9 months. She was found because her and her captor were out in public, and she was recognized by somebody and they called the police. Amanda Berry, Gina DeJesus, and Michelle Knight, they were all held captive by a man in Cleveland over a course of 2 years. They were all beaten, abused, raped, held against their will. One of the ladies found an opening in one of the windows and was able to get the attention of a neighbor. The exploitation of women and children are the focus of the sex offenses that we are going to discuss. And we're going to talk about paraphilia. Generally, it means bizarre or abnormal sexual practices that may involve non-human objects, humiliation, or children. And there's no consensus that has been found for any precise border between unusual sexual interests and paraphilic ones. However, there have been some identified as social harm and subject to criminal penalties, meaning they're against the law. Frauderism, the practice of achieving sexual stimulation or orgasm by touching and rubbing against a person without a person's consent, and that generally occurs in public. Voyeurism, the practice of gaining sexual pleasure from watching others when they are naked or engaged in sexual activity. Exhibitionism, a a perversion in which sexual gratification is obtained from the indecent exposure of one's genitalia, usually to a stranger. Pedophilia is sexual perversion in which children are the preferred sexual object. Sadomasochism is the interaction, especially sexual activity, in which one person enjoys inflicting physical or mental suffering on another person, or who derives pleasure from experiencing pain. All of these are criminal in nature, and someone could be subjected to criminal penalties for engaging in any of these practices. Let's speak specifically about pedophilia. Pedophilia is a psychiatric disorder in which an adult or older adolescent experiences a primary or exclusive sexual attraction to prepubescent children. Although girls typically begin the process of puberty at age 10 or 11 and boys at 11 or 12, the criteria for pedophilia extend that cutoff point up to the age of 13. And before a person can be diagnosed with pedophilia, there's some criteria. The person must be at least 16 years old and at least 5 years older than the child for the attraction to be diagnosed as pedophilia. And pedophilia is the most concerning paraphilia to the general public. And both men and women can participate or be diagnosed with pedophilia, and there's some number of examples in the book. From those criminologists who study this disorder, and not just criminologists, but psychologists, they've cited numerous suspected causes of pedophilia, including abnormal brain structure, social maladaptation, neurological dysfunction or brain trauma, inherited genetic factors, exposure to pornography, which then results in cognitive distortions, I should have said first. So those are some of the suspected causes of pedophilia. We're going to continue talking about more sex-related offenses. The next up is going to be prostitution and a discussion on pornography.